headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
First, Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, has told schools to root out activist teachers because some left-wing teachers deliberately brainwash kids to round to their point of view. And this comes after a 6-year-old boy's parents were warned that he could be considered transphobic because he was a bit confused at the sight of a boy wearing a dress. This is madness, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a few different issues to unpick here, actually. So I think, first of all, you've got Nadeem trying to root out activism in schools. And, whilst I entirely agree that children should not be brainwashed and they should be, taught to develop their own opinions about things, it won't have missed people's attentions that this story seems to have arisen because the teacher in this case was getting children to write letters about Partygate. So, there might be a bit of a different issue there. I think the story about, the very young child being called transphobic is really quite shocking, actually, because whatever you think about the right of a child to, cast, to determine their own identity and, whatever role gender has in that, to calls a very young child without a real understanding, many would say, of those kind of issues transphobic is pretty unpleasant, isn't it?
And also, adults who don't seem to comprehend that the average 6-year-old kid might not quite get across why a little boy was wearing a dress. An adult taking that view, that this 6-year-old is transphobic. I mean, what is going on in the adult's head? It's just a confused little kid who doesn't quite understand what he's seeing. It's nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, what does that term even mean? I mean, it's an adult's interpretation, quite incorrectly, in my view, applied to a child. I do think there is an issue here, though, and it's a subject that I know many people feel very strongly about. It's quite controversial. The separate issue, which is of, is there a place for gender titles in schools? What do we think about gender stereotyping? I do think actually it's a bit more of a nuanced issue, because I think, personally, I am vehemently against anything that would erase gender, or particularly erase women. So, this idea that you have gender neutral toilets, the idea that you have transgender athletes competing against women, I think ignores a biological reality. That said, I think if there are ways that we can reduce unnecessary gender stereotypes, then, why wouldn't we? And actually, there are many children. I've got a 5-year-old girl who is very adamant that she is either gender neutral, or maybe even a boy, would hate being called Miss, hates being called Little Miss. She's like, I'm a big mister. And actually, when you see it from that perspective, anything that kind of breaks down and maybe gets rid of stereotyping, I personally would be in favour of.
So is your little girl what we used to in my day when I was at school call a tomboy?
Yeah, I think she is, and that's it's not a drama, it's not a big deal. But I think funny actually, about a couple of years ago now, we had a friend round, and the friend said, an adult friend said, "Oh, aren't you a great little miss?" And, the 2 or 3 year old looked at the friend. She's literally her words. She said, I am not a little miss. I'm a big mister. But actually, it's a tomboy, and why not? And, I do think, on a serious note, there are some children who actually would not want to be stereotyped in that way.
Sure. There are these trans issues, though, as perhaps when they're a little older than 6, but as kids get older, I think, this is part of the modern conversation, part of the modern debate, and a reality of modern society. And I think kids should know about this stuff, but they should also know about opposing viewpoints. It's about the panorama of all knowledge, not just one viewpoint. And that's what Nadeem Zahawi said. He said we should make sure that teachers impart to kids a balanced presentation of opposing views. And we know that isn't happening all over the country. And there are still schools, even though it's discredited, teaching critical race theory and the theories of white privilege. And that has to stop, doesn't it?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think, as Nadeem has said, the key word here is balanced. And, it is, as you've said, Kevin, it's a panorama. And we should never teach one theory as fact, because, life is generally more nuanced on that. So, absolutely agree with that. And I think from what we've seen, potentially actually in a different context, but certainly during COVID, our parents have been very worried about the level of almost indoctrination actually in that context. And, so I think anything that instills balance and teaches children to think for themselves, we would absolutely applaud.
Indeed. Moving on, apparently, according to one organisation, kids should not refer to their teachers as Sir and Miss anymore. This is from the National Education Union. Dr. Ellie Barnes told teachers they ought to be moving towards a gender-free model in education, and therefore teachers should only be referred to as teacher, because Sir and Miss genders them. And also teachers should drop the words like boy, girl, son and mother, and replace them with gender-neutral phrases. So if kids can't call teachers Sir and Miss, that's going to kind of change the sound of the classrooms, isn't it?
I mean, look, it is a bit, and I think you get to the point here. What are you going to call them instead? And as I've said, I'm not against, and I appreciate I might not be at one with all of your listeners here, but I wouldn't be against less gender classification and stereotyping. I do think there are some children for whom it is unhelpful. That said, I think you've got to recognise biological facts, haven't you? I suppose, what you might ask is, in a teaching context, why is it relevant? So I think there are some contexts in which biology and biological differentiation is very relevant. And obviously you have the example of athletes competing in a sporting field where, I think many of us would say that the attempt to get rid of gender has gone far too far. It's ignoring a reality. I would say there are other areas, and maybe the classroom is one, where actually you don't need to differentiate like that. But then I think you get to the question, well, what are you going to call your teacher? I'm sure there's lots of teachers who probably wouldn't like being called just teacher,
Yes.
So I think you have to have an alternative if you're not going to do that. But
yeah, no, I agree. It's a stranger area these days, education, and Nadeem Zahawi, I do think, has a point. I totally agree with you, Molly. We've got to be careful that kids are not brainwashed. They should get, as I said, the panorama of all viewpoints and then make up their own minds. That's what worries me, that some of these left-wing teachers are not letting the kids think for themselves, and that is an abrogation of educational duty, if you ask me.
Good talk. Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio. Listen on your smart speaker. Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.